You're alone at a remote outpost. The mountains whisper names you don't recognize. Your flashlight catches movement in the scope, but thermal shows nothing. Welcome to 5 True Military Horror Stories. Tonight, we expose soldiers' darkest secrets, boots left perfectly aligned where a man vanished, ghostly laughter in an abandoned school turned barracks, jungle footsteps that followed a team for miles. And that final bunker, something waited inside wearing a dead comrade's face. These aren't enemy encounters. This is the unexplained. Press play if you dare.
The Silent Watch. It was a cold and eerie night in the mountains of Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Jack was on a routine patrol with his unit when they were sent out to a remote outpost. The place had a long, tragic history, with several soldiers going missing without a trace. Many of the locals believed the mountains are haunted by demons, but Jack had never been one for superstition. He dismissed the warnings and focused on the mission at hand. As they arrived, the outpost seemed abandoned, but everything was perfectly intact. The lights still worked, and there was even some food left behind. It didn't make sense, but Jack and his team took the necessary precautions and set up camp for the night. Hours passed, and everything seemed normal. But as midnight struck, Jack noticed something strange. One of his men, Private Miller, was missing. Jack assumed he'd gone for a walk or to check something out. But as the hours wore on and Miller didn't return, a sense of unease settled over the group. The search party began at dawn. They scoured the perimeter of the outpost, calling out Miller's name. But as they reached the edge of the mountain, they found something terrifying. Miller's boots neatly lined up on the ground, as if he had simply disappeared. The chilling part was the way the boots were positioned, perfectly aligned, with no signs of struggle. The squad returned to the outpost, shaken and confused. That night, Jack took over the watch while the others tried to sleep. As he stood by the window, watching the darkened mountain range, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Through the scope of his rifle, he could see a figure standing at the edge of the mountain, watching them. It wasn't one of his men. The figure was tall, thin, and wearing an old military uniform from decades ago. The figure stood still for what seemed like hours before vanishing into the darkness. The next day, when they went to investigate, there was no sign of anyone or anything in the area. They returned to base, but Jack could never shake the feeling that they were being watched. The figure never appeared again, but the feeling of unease haunted him every time he went on patrol. The Ghost of the Warzone. In the heat of the Iraq War, Sergeant Mike was stationed at one of the most dangerous bases in the region. His unit was tasked with patrolling the outskirts of a small town that had been ravaged by conflict. The area was known for being volatile, and every day brought new threats. However, it wasn't the enemy that scared Mike. It was the eerie feeling that plagued the base. It started with the strange noises at night. Scratching sounds on the walls of the barracks, whispers in the wind, and footsteps in the sand when no one was around. Mike tried to dismiss it as the stress of war and the isolation they felt in the desert. But as the days went on, the noises became harder to ignore. One night after a particularly harrowing firefight, Mike was on night watch. As he stood alone on the perimeter, he heard something that made his heart race. A child's laughter. He whipped around, expecting to see one of his fellow soldiers playing a cruel prank. But there was no one there. Mike checked the area, his heart pounding in his chest. The laughter echoed again, but this time it was closer. It was coming from inside the base. As he moved cautiously toward the barracks, the laughter grew louder and a strange chill filled the air. Mike entered the barracks, his gun drawn, and found nothing. But as he turned to leave, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A faint, ghostly figure of a child standing at the end of the hallway. The figure was translucent, with hollow eyes and a faint smile. Mike froze, unable to move as the child's laughter echoed through the hall. Suddenly, the figure vanished. The next morning, Mike reported the incident to his superior officer, but the officer just nodded, as if he'd heard similar stories before. It wasn't long before Mike learned that the base had once been a school, and during the war, many innocent civilians had been killed there, including children. Mike's encounters with the ghostly child continued, but after that night, he never felt the same. He couldn't escape the feeling that the spirits of those lost in the war were still lingering, haunting the men who fought in the land of the dead. The Phantom of the Jungle. Lieutenant David and his Special Forces team were deep in the jungles of Vietnam on a covert mission to sabotage enemy supply lines. They had been in the dense jungle for days, navigating treacherous terrain and avoiding enemy patrols. The team had already been through numerous firefights, but nothing could prepare them for what was about to happen. One evening, as the team set up camp by a small creek, they began to hear strange sounds. Low growls, rustling in the trees, and what sounded like footsteps just outside their camp. At first, they thought it was a wild animal, but as the night wore on, the sounds grew more deliberate, more human. David and his team stayed silent, their nerves on edge, as they listened to the sounds grow closer. But when they peered out into the darkness, there was nothing there. The jungle had fallen eerily silent. The next morning, the team went on their patrol. As they moved deeper into the jungle, they came across something terrifying. An old, weathered military helmet lying in the dirt. It was from the American forces, but it looked as though it had been there for decades. What was even more chilling was the fact that there was no body. David ordered the team to stay alert. But as they moved further, they noticed something else. Footprints in the mud. They were fresh, and they led deeper into the jungle. The team followed the tracks for hours, but they never found the source. Just as they were about to give up, they heard it, footsteps directly behind them, as if someone was following them. They turned around, but there was no one there. That night, the strange sounds returned. This time, however, the footsteps were louder and the growls more distinct. The team was on edge, ready for an ambush, but nothing came. The next morning, they found their radio equipment damaged, and one of their men had vanished without a trace. David called for a retreat, but as they left the jungle, the sounds of footsteps continued to echo in their ears. It wasn't until much later that David learned about a ghostly legend from the war. It was said that a soldier had disappeared in that exact part of the jungle during the 1960s, and his spirit had haunted the area ever since. No one knew if it was a supernatural presence or just the horrors of war playing tricks on their minds. The Haunting of Camp Echo. Camp Echo was a remote military base nestled in the mountains of Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Nick had been stationed there for months, and despite the beautiful scenery, there was something off about the place. He had heard rumors from other soldiers, tales of strange occurrences and mysterious disappearances. One night, after a long patrol, Nick and his unit were assigned to stand guard. As they set up their posts, they noticed something strange. a series of unexplained lights flickering in the distance. At first, they thought it was enemy activity, but when they checked, there was nothing there. Later that night, as Nick sat alone in his watchtower, he heard soft voices calling his name. He thought it was one of his comrades playing a prank, but when he looked out over the base, he saw nothing. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and Nick felt a chill run down his spine. The next morning, a fellow soldier was found dead in his barracks. There were no signs of a struggle, but the soldier's expression was one of sheer terror. The strange lights returned that night, and Nick could feel something was wrong. The ghostly voices seemed to come from everywhere, but there was no one to be seen. That night, Nick confronted his commanding officer and demanded answers. The officer looked at him grimly and told him the truth. The base was built on the site of an old military hospital, where countless soldiers had died during a previous war. It was said that their spirits still lingered, unable to rest in peace. Nick's encounters with the restless spirits continued until the day he left Camp Echo, but the haunting voices never stopped. The last mission, Captain Greg and his team were on a dangerous mission to clear out an enemy stronghold in the middle of the desert. They had been planning the operation for months, and the stakes were high. As they approached the compound, they encountered heavy resistance. They fought bravely, but the enemy had the upper hand. In the chaos, Greg and his team found themselves trapped in a bunker. The enemy surrounded them, and their only hope was a rescue team that was supposed to arrive soon. But as the hours dragged on, they began to hear strange sounds, heavy breathing, scratching on the walls, and whispers. One of the soldiers, Private Andrews, began to panic, convinced that they were not alone. He swore that he could see figures moving in the shadows, figures that didn't belong. Greg tried to calm him down, but the sounds grew louder and closer. Suddenly, the door to the bunker burst open, and a figure appeared in the doorway, covered in dust and blood, wearing an old military uniform. It was one of Greg's former comrades who had died during a previous mission. The ghostly soldier stared at them, his face twisted in agony. Before anyone could react, the figure vanished, and the sounds ceased. Moments later, the rescue team arrived and pulled them out of the bunker. But as Greg looked back at the compound, he could swear he saw the ghostly soldier standing in the doorway, waiting